This conference will now be recorded.
Hello everybody, and welcome back to our class on Microsoft Excel formulas and functions. My name is Keith Beagin. I'm the System Technology Trainer for the Mercer County Library System. And in this video, we'll be going over the most important aspects from this class. All right, so keep in mind this video is not a full class recorded. Instead, what I've done here is just created a sort of abridged version of the class that reviews the most important and perhaps newest aspects of our formulas and functions class. So in this class, we're going to introduce some new things that we haven't done in our previous Excel classes. So since we're dealing with formulas and functions so much, we're going to be using a specific command called the insert function command to build our formulas, which will help us, especially with the more complex ones that we'll get to a bit later. We're also going to be referencing other worksheets, something we haven't done yet. Okay, more on that in a few minutes. We're also going to create absolute references, another new thing that we will get to very shortly. And then we're going to get into two specific functions that I think are very useful for multi-purpose use, but also they'll just help you understand how we build not only these formulas, but all kinds of formulas. So we're going to be using the SUMIFS function to add arguments. And by that, I basically just mean different data values that meet specific criteria. So for example, you want to add up a bunch of items, but only those that are sold in a specific store. All right, so that would be the criterion in that example. Another function I'm going to introduce is the VLOOKUP function, which allows you to look up and autofill things from another data range. So for example, if you type in a product ID into your worksheet, it will automatically generate the price attached to that product ID without you having to look for it. All right, so let's go ahead and jump into Excel. Okay, so what we have here is essentially a big worksheet in which we are tracking the sales across our company called Smart Cookie Bakery. As you can see in columns A and B, we have our last names and first names set up for our salespeople. In column C, the regions to which they belong. In columns D, E, and F, we're keeping track of the total number of cookies sold per cookie type. All right, and then we have some other labels set up here that we're going to fill in as we go. In fact, let me just keep this over here for now. Okay. Now, before I start adding anything to this worksheet, I want to just quickly go over the formula bar. If you follow my mouse pointer here, above the worksheet, above the column letters, you will see that bar. We talked about this in previous Excel classes, but we haven't really used it too much. The formula bar is going to be really important for this class, okay, because it is where we go to view active formulas and functions, but it's also where we go to modify them, which will come into play a bit later. Okay, it's also the safest way to modify your formulas. Now, in that formula bar, you will see a little button here with an FX. And when I point at it, it does say insert function. Okay, we're going to be using this command soon. When you click it, it will launch a dialog box, and you simply select the function you want to use. So for example, here's VLOOKUP, here's SUMIFS. I've used this recently, that's why those two are showing up at the top. Typically though, if you're not seeing the function you need in this initial list, you'll simply go into this box, erase what's there, type in the one you need, and click go. And then it will show up in the list at the bottom. Now when you select your function and click OK, it will open a new dialog box called function arguments. Okay, and arguments are basically the pieces of the formula that you need to reference in order to build that formula. Okay, and again, the benefit of building formulas in this way is that it kind of walks you through it. So it's telling me that I need a lookup value, I need a table array, a column index number, and a range lookup. Things we'll get to in a little bit, so we kind of understand what those are. All right, but if you look to the right, sometimes it kind of gives you little hints. This says equals any, equals number, equals logical. All right, and down at the bottom, you'll see a more detailed definition of what that specific field requires. All right. Now, another big benefit to using this, aside from helping us build the formula, is that another thing we're going to be talking about is referencing other worksheets. Okay. In our Intro to Excel class and our Excel Essentials class, we build we built formulas by referencing data within the same sheet, which is often what we need to do. But sometimes you want to reference data from another sheet or maybe from another workbook entirely, which is possible as well. All right, this is especially the case with something like VLOOKUP, where the data you need is in a different place and you want to basically connect it to the sheet you're in. All right, so using this dialog box here, which we got to through insert function, this will also help us in the process of referencing a different worksheet or workbook. Now I'm going to go to the bottom right hand corner and click cancel because we don't need this as of yet. All right, last but not least, another reason I'm pointing out the formula bar is because, like I said before, we are in some cases going to want to modify a formula. Sometimes it is easier if you want to reuse a formula but potentially apply it to different data values. It's easier to just copy and paste the formula and then just tweak the data, the references in that formula, rather than building an entire new formula from scratch. And it's best to do that here in the formula bar. It's also where we need to go to create absolute references, which is a term I used earlier. All right, so again, just pointing out here that we will make heavy use of the formula bar and the insert function command over to the left. All right, and we'll talk about absolute references actually right now. Let's talk about that real quick because we're going to come to that very shortly. So here in column G, I have a label called total units sold. So we've done something similar to this in our previous Excel classes. This one's pretty simple. In order to calculate this sum, total units sold, I would be adding the values from columns D, E, and F. So for example, for row 2 here, I would be adding up D2 plus E2 plus F2 to give me a total units sold. Okay, so let me go ahead and do that. All right, so there it is. Now, when it comes to applying this AutoSum formula to the remaining rows, I could simply autofill it. But what that's going to do is use something called relative referencing. So let me autofill it and then explain what I mean. All right. So if we look at the syntax, and by that I mean the way the formula is spelled out, this says equal sum and in parentheses D2 through F2. Now when I go to apply that to the remaining rows, excuse me, notice what it's doing. It's using the same 3 columns, D through F, but updating the row number in relation to the row I'm in, row 3. So that's why we call it relative referencing, because it is applying the formula, but updating the syntax slightly in relation to the row you're in. Or in some cases, if you're going across, it'll be updating the columns you're in. Okay, so that's relative referencing. That's what we've seen up to this point in our Excel classes. Now, I have another tab in my workbook here called product list. I'm going to click on that right now. So suppose I want to multiply something from the other sheet by this price of $3.29. Now, I could do that. The problem is when I go to autofill, it's going to use relative referencing, which means that as I go down a column, it will also go down this column, which means the next cell would multiply by 299, the next cell 279, and then eventually nothing. Okay, so sometimes we want to create what's called an absolute reference. So every time, so as I autofill down a column, it will always multiply it by this cell C2, where it says 329, and that will not change. And that's what we call an absolute reference. So let's go back to the sales by employee sheet. All right, so here's an example right here. In column H, we have total revenue chocolate chip. So it looks like what I want to do is I'm breaking down my revenue by cookie type. All right, so in the case of chocolate chip, I'll be multiplying the total chocolate chip sold, which is found in cell D2, 591 in this case. I'll be multiplying that number by its price, because remember, the prices for each cookie type are different. So we need to use absolute referencing. Okay, so we're using absolute referencing, but we're also referencing another sheet. So we're kind of doing two new things in one shot here. So let me click on cell H2 where the formula needs to go. Now, because I'm going to be referencing another sheet, I would recommend using the insert function tool as I discussed earlier. So now that I've selected H2, I'm going to go up to that button and click on it. Now in this case, I'm multiplying, so the function I need is product. Product, and here it is right here in the list. Remember, if it's not there, just look for it using the box above. And then click go, and then select it. Now I'm going to click OK, and it brings me to my function arguments dialog box where I now build the formula. So now it's asking me for the first reference. It's going to put something in there most likely. We can just erase that and make it our own. So the cell I need to reference in this sheet is D2, so I'll just go ahead and type in D2. Now I'm multiplying that by that price of 329, which is found in cell C2 of the other sheet. So I need to do a little bit differently this time. So I'm going to click into the next box that says number 2, but because I'm going to another sheet, I'm going to go to the right here and collapse this dialog box temporarily, which will help you. So you'll see an up arrow here. I'm going to click on this. It will collapse the dialog box and allow me to go back down into the work area and select whatever data I need to put into that box. So now I'm going to go down to the other tab, click on it, go to that cell of C2, click on it, and now that I've selected my cell reference, I can go back up into that dialog box, go to the right. That up arrow is now a down arrow to reopen the dialog box. I'll click on it, and notice how it filled it in for me. Now all I need to do is go to the bottom right and click OK. It's giving you another number box in case there are other things you need to multiply, but we do not, so we're just going to click on OK. Now it brings me back to the other tab, to the other sheet, and gives me my answer of 1944.39. Okay, so here's where things get a bit tricky again. Now we want to apply that formula to the remaining rows of data. But as I mentioned earlier, by doing a simple autofill, which we have done, that's going to use relative referencing, which means if we look at the syntax here, D2, as I go down the column D will remain the same, but the row number will update because I'm going down row by row. The same is the case for C2 here, which is from the other sheet. As I go down this column, it will remain in column C, but the row numbers will update consecutively. That we don't want because we want to always be referencing that one price of 329 found in cell C2. So that means that the D2 here that one we are going to allow to update through relative referencing because that one we do want to match what's going on in column D here as we go down. We want that to update. However, C2 we want to lock in. So we're going to make this an absolute reference. So what we need to do is click into that syntax. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you can do it as I'm doing it right now in the cell, but it's much safer to do it in your formula bar because you risk potentially adding something to the syntax or changing something and it will corrupt the formula. All right, so let me exit this cell safely by pressing enter, go back up into the formula bar, and I'm going to click anywhere in that C2 reference. It could be right before the C, right after the 2, or in between. Okay. Now, typically you can press your F4 key on a PC and it will make it an absolute reference. In my case, I have a slightly different setup, so I have to do it manually. Now, to create an absolute reference manually, it's very simple. You'll place a $ before the column letter, and a dollar sign before the row number. And then I'll just press enter. Pressing enter will exit the formula bar and put me back onto the sheet. Okay, now the answer is the same, of course, but look at the updated syntax. As I mentioned, $C, $2, which means that now if I autofill, look at the syntax here, we have D3. So in that case, that cell reference updated relatively. But over here, we have an absolute reference of C2, so that did not update. That's locked into that 329 price. So the information is correct. All right, now, as I mentioned before, sometimes it is easier when you want to apply a formula to maybe other columns as you go across, or maybe other rows. When you want to apply a formula, but some of the cell references might need to be modified, it is easier, rather than rebuild it from scratch for each other column, just copy and paste the formula as is, and then tweak it in your formula bar. So allow me to demonstrate. Suppose I want to now take this formula and apply it to the total revenue oatmeal in column I. So I'll select cell H2, and now I'm just going to autofill it over to the right. Great, now let's look at this. So through relative referencing, again, that first cell reference is correct of E2, because now it's moving over to total oatmeal sold. However, because of the absolute reference, it's still locked into cell C3. I'm sorry, C2, excuse me. Okay, so let me exit this for a second, and let's find out where the price for oatmeal is in our product list tab. Here it is, $2.99, found in cell C3. So that means if I go back to my other sheet, go to this formula, go into the formula bar, and just change that C2 to a C3. Keep the absolute reference, syntax, the dollar signs. Just change the 2 to a 3, press enter, and now this is correct. And then I can go ahead and autofill down the column. I'll do the same thing to column J here for total revenue sugar. I will autofill this over to J2. Now I need to find out where the price was in my product list. It was in cell C4, $2.79. So now I'll just go into the formula bar and change that C3 to a C4. Press enter. Now the information is correct, and I'll autofill it down column J. All right, and I have one more column so far, column K. This one's pretty simple. We have a grand total revenue. Suppose I just want to know the grand total that each salesperson earned in revenue, okay? Because remember, the salespeople are over here in columns A, B, last name, first name. So this one is similar to what we did earlier, but it's going to be adding the values from columns H through J. So now I'll just do an auto sum here, and then autofill down. All right, and just for the sake of consistency, I'm going to go ahead and just format all these currency values for currency. All right, now I also have created a separate table on the right here. Let me zoom in a bit. A table called 2022 sales by region. Okay, so I'm working with the same data in the same sheet, but I've separated it because this is going to work a bit differently. So now I want to know the breakdown by region. All right. Far West, Great Lakes, Mideast, New England, Plains, Rocky Mountains, Southeast, and Southwest. And it looks like what I want to know is the total units sold per region and the grand total revenue per region. Now remember, we have those values technically already set up in columns G for total units sold and column K for grand total revenue. But here's the issue. If we look at our regions from column C, there are several instances of each one. Right off the bat, I can see 4 Great Lakes. All right, so if I want to break down per region, I'm going to have to add, if I want to break down per region, let's say for total units sold, I will have to add a condition, essentially. I'm going to have to tell the program to, in the case of, let's say, Great Lakes, only add the total units sold values that are associated with the Great Lakes. So it would not add this 1503 because that's associated with Far West. Don't want that, but we do want this one here and any others that are related in the same row or by the same row to, in this case, Great Lakes. And we want to do the same thing for all the other regions. So this is why we use a function called SUMIFS. It allows us to add up values that meet a specific criteria, or even in some cases, multiple criteria. So let me scroll back over. So I'm going to click into cell M3 here, because that's, of course, where the formula needs to go. Once again, because this is a more complex formula, I'm going to use the insert function command up there in my formula bar. And it launches my insert function dialog box. And as I said before, because I used this recently, I see SUMIFS right here in the list. Keep in mind there's another function with a very similar name called SUMIF without the S at the end. In this case, though, you're going to want to use SUMIFS because we have that multiple criteria. All right, SUMIFS at the end of that. Now that I've selected the correct function, I'm going to go down here and click OK. So now it's giving me my, again, what we call arguments, all right? Essentially the data I need to reference to build this formula. So first it's asking me for a sum range, then it's asking me for a criteria range 1. So your sum range means the range of data you're going to use to add, excuse me, okay? So in other words, the data values that I want to add up, where do those belong? Okay, so let's start. We're in total units sold here on our table. Sorry for the little click and drag there, the little scroll. So we're going to be dealing with column G right now. Okay, so what we want to do in this case, because we're dealing with an entire range of data, we're going to want to click and drag to select multiple cells. So I'm going to start with G2 on my sheet and drag down to G33, which is the last value in that range. Once I've done that, it will reopen my function arguments dialog box, and you can see in the sum range field, it does say G2 colon G3. Now it's asking me for the criteria range. So basically, what are the conditions? What's the criteria that those values need to meet? Well, those are the region names. So now I'm going to click into this field and do the same thing. I'll just go back down to my sheet, scroll over and up to column C and select C2 through C33. Great. Now it's giving me a new box, criteria 1. All right. This is kind of the same idea as a lookup value, like we're going to see in VLOOKUP shortly. Okay. Basically, it means I could either establish a specific criteria. So for example, if I'm only concerned with Far West, I could type in Far West. Okay. But because I want to look it up for each and every region, I'm going to use a cell reference. So let me elaborate again real quick. Let me scroll up here. So look what I've done in column L. I've already set up the region names. So in this particular cell M3, I'm going to want to reference cell L3 as my criteria. So it's going to look in cell L3. And then it's going to see that far west has already been entered, and then it's going to match that value to whatever's in column C. All right, so just to reiterate, in criteria 1, you could technically put in a specific value by name. All right, but in this case, we're going to want to use a cell reference because when we go to autofill down column M here, we're going to want it to, through relative referencing, update that criteria cell to the other regions, L4, L5, etc. So with all that said, in criteria 1, I'm going to type in cell L3. And then I will click OK. Perfect. So now in the case of cell M3 where it says 5968, it is adding up the values from column G, but only the ones that relate to the far west region. Now I want to apply this to the down column M to match up the other regions, but we have another problem. Again, relative referencing. As I mentioned before, the L3, that one you do want to update depending on the row you're in. So that one we want to leave open to relative referencing. However, look at our other two cell ranges. If I go down, all right, columns G and C will remain the same. However, the row numbers will update consecutively. So for example, if I go down one more row, this will update to G3 to G34, and then G4 to G35, etc., etc. And that's going to throw off that range and mess up, essentially give me inaccurate information. The same thing for the C2 to C33 range. So we want to lock those in as absolute references. So what I'll do is just go back into the syntax in my formula bar and make them absolute references. So I'll place a dollar sign before G and before 2, another one before G and before 33, and the same for my C2 to C33 range. Here it is up close. So now I can safely autofill M4 through M10. And I know that my information is accurate. Okay, now we want to apply a sum ifs formula to column N as well under grand total revenue. And as I mentioned before, in this case, I think it would be easier, rather than rebuild the formula, just copy and paste what we already have and then just tweak the cell references. So I'm going to go to cell M3. I will autofill to the right into cell N3. All right, it's going to give me a 0, but that's okay. Because remember, I need to update the formula now. So now I'm going to click on cell N3. So that one's to isolate. All right, remember, it's going to leave M3 and N3 both selected after you do that initial autofill. So just click on cell N3 only. So that's the only cell you're working in. Now in this case, I'm dealing with grand total revenue. So I'm not referencing column G anymore. I'm referencing column K. So that means I need to go into the formula bar, change G2 to G33 to K2, K33, but I'm going to leave those as absolute references. Okay. Also, because of relative referencing, that L3 where it says far west, it updated it to M3, which is not going to give me the answer I need. So I'm going to change the M3 back to L3, but leave it open to relative referencing. There's the correct answer. Again, here's the syntax up close. And then I'll just go ahead and autofill down N4 to N10. And because those are currency values, I may as well format them for currency. Okay, so now that leaves us with one more function to discuss, and that is VLOOKUP. For this one, I'm going to go into the other sheet called product list. Now, suppose I'm a salesperson for my company, I'm in a specific store, and I'm now generating an order for the store. They're telling me what they want for each product. I'm going to go ahead and generate that order for them. Okay, so let's just set this up over here, and we'll start in column E as sort of a separate table. Now, what I want to do as a salesperson is simply enter the product ID, which we find in column A, and have that generate an item name and a price. So I don't have to put all that in. It just generates it, and then whatever, and then depending on how many they order, it will generate the rest of the math. Okay, so basically, in other words, by entering the product ID, it's just going to do everything else for me. And that we can do through VLOOKUP. Okay, so again, typically with VLOOKUP, you would be referencing another sheet or another workbook entirely because the data is being pulled from somewhere else and being put into a new sheet. Essentially, what I'm talking about is a database, okay? But because I want you to see all the data in one place, I'm just going to keep it all in the same sheet, all right? So let me go ahead and in cell E1 create a label called product ID. I'll very quickly create the remaining labels. Okay, so as I think you can see where I'm going with this, by simply entering a value into this column, it will basically generate everything else. So in order to start our VLOOKUP, we actually need to put it in column F under item name, because what we need to tell the program is to, through a formula, generate the item name by what I put in column E. Kind of like what we saw with some ifs with our criteria. We put in L3, for example. It's a similar idea here, okay, a lookup value. So that's why we're putting the formula here, because we want the answer to be dependent upon what we put in column E. So in cell F2, I'm going to go up, I've selected that cell, I'll go up to the formula bar and click on the insert function command again, and this time I'm going to select the VLOOKUP function and click OK. All right, so let's talk about these fields here, starting with lookup value. This one's kind of backwards to what we saw with some ifs. First, it's asking me where I'm going to enter my lookup value. So again, if we look at our sheet, that's going to, at least for now, begin with cell E2, which we can update through relative referencing, but we're going to start with E2. So when I type in a product ID, it generates the item name. So in lookup value, I'm going to type in E2. Now it's asking for a table array. This basically is asking you to select the entire table you're referencing. And you do want to select the entire table, not just the specific columns you need, because if you want to include additional columns, eventually, you don't have to update the table array. So you'll see what I mean by that in a second. So the table array I need is A1 through C4. So I'll go ahead and select it. And if we look in my dialog box, it did correctly put in A1 through C4. Now it's asking me for a column index number. All right. And it says right here, it is the column number in the table array from which the matching value should be returned. Okay, the matching value should be returned. The matching value, in other words, what matches the value that relates to what I put as my lookup value in column E. So I'm looking for an item name, so that means the matching value is going to come from column B. Okay, but it's asking you for a column index number. So that just means that you need to count the number of columns from your lookup value column, okay? So my lookup value is going to be coming from column A, and that counts as column 1, which means column B is column 2. So in column index number in that field, I'll place a 2. Now, a quick thing to keep in mind with VLOOKUP, okay, your lookup value must come from your leftmost column. Okay, now, if newer versions of Excel, 2021, for example, supports a new function called XLOOKUP, which is a bit more flexible. But this is classic VLOOKUP, which means that while it is very, very useful, you must your lookup value must come from your leftmost column. All right. That doesn't mean that it always has to be column A. It just means that whatever table array I select, it has to be from the leftmost column in that table array. All right, so let's go back to the dialog box. I've entered column number 2. Finally, it's asking for range lookup. This is a logical value, okay? And it says right here in the definition, it is a logical value to find the closest match in the first column equals true or omitted. To find an exact match equals false. So basically, it's asking for a true false, okay? True, think of it as an approximate match, okay, or a closest match. False is an exact match. We're going to want exact match, okay, because we're going to know the product IDs. We're not going to mess that up, so we want an exact match. So I'm going to type in false, and then I'll click OK. Now it's going to show NA. That's because we did not yet enter anything into cell E2, okay, and we'll get there in a second. Now I want to apply that formula to the other 2 rows. We'll just do these 2 rows for now. Of course, we could do more, but we're just going to keep it simple. Okay. Now, before I do that, though, let's think again on relative versus absolute referencing. All right. In this case, I could autofill down and use relative referencing because it would work correctly, right? Because the E2 will now become F2, which is my next product ID lookup value. A1 is C4, okay? In this case, I'm sorry, I misspoke. In this case, we want to establish this as an absolute reference because if by relative referencing, that would become A2 to C5, for example, and it's going to throw off our table array. The column number can stay the same, however. All right, so let's go ahead and make A1 to C4 both absolute references. I'm going to go back into my formula bar and change those 2 to absolute. And here's how the resulting formula will look. So now I'm going to go ahead and autofill down to F3 and F4. Now we want to apply the same VLOOKUP formula to column G for price because that is another value, another matching value to our product ID. It's also a value we need if we're going to generate the subtotal, sales tax, etc. that we see over here on the right. So once again, I'm not going to rebuild it from scratch. I'll just copy and paste the existing VLOOKUP and just tweak the cell references. So I'm going to go to F2, select it, autofill over to G2. And let's look at the formula very quickly. Remember, if you're doing that, be very careful. I still have F2 and G2 both selected, so I'm going to want to make sure I click on only G2. That's the only cell I want to be working in. All right, because of relative referencing, that E2, which is the product ID column, my lookup value, that was updated to F2. So that's not going to be correct. So once again, I need to change that back to E2. Oh, actually, before I do that, I should do it the right way by doing it in my formula bar. Sorry about that. Okay, I'll do that in 1 second. But we don't need to make it an absolute reference because, again, we do want the lookup value to update relatively. Of course, the table array can be locked in as an absolute reference, A1 to C4, that will not change. Another thing we're going to need to tweak is the column number, the column index number. Remember, we need to count the number of columns away from our lookup value column. So in this case, product ID was column 1, item name was column 2, price, column C, was column 3. So what I need to do is change the F2 to an E2 and change the 2 to a 3. So let me go do that in my formula bar. And then once again, let's look at this one more time. There's the updated formula, E2, and I changed the 2 to a 3. And now, because we've already established A1 to C4's absolute references, I don't need to tweak this anymore when I autofill down, so I can just go ahead and do it. Now, quantity here, that's just going to be manually entered. All right. So we're not going to worry about that just yet. Let's go to column I under subtotal. So now this will be a simple multiplication formula. We'll be multiplying the price by the quantity ordered. So you can use the product function again, as we did earlier, because that is the function used for multiplication, or because this is a simple one with just 2 references, we could just do it manually. So I've selected I2, I'll put in the equal sign. The first cell I need to reference is G2. I'm going to put the multiplication symbol in, that's going to be Shift 8 to get the asterisk, and then H2 for the quantity. And then I'll press enter. Again, NA, because we haven't entered any data yet. We'll come to that soon. Now let me go ahead and autofill that through and use relative referencing to apply it to I3 and I4. Now we come to our sales tax. This is going to be, just like in real life, a fixed sales tax percentage applied to the subtotal. So let's just pretend that our sales tax is 7%. So this is, again, a simple multiplication. So I'm going to put in the equal sign. I'll put in 7%. Remember, you do not need to convert it to a decimal. I'll put in the multiplication symbol, and I'm going to multiply it by the subtotal value, I2. Press enter, and apply that through autofill, through relative referencing to J3 and J4. Finally, we come to our grand total, which is going to add the subtotal to the sales tax. Again, you can use the sum function, but let's just keep it simple and add up those 2 values without the use of a function. So I'll just press the equal sign, put in I2, plus sign, J2. And then I will now apply that via autofill, via relative referencing to K3 to K4. Now let's go back over here and see how this works. In product ID, we'll just keep them in the same row. Let's say the manager I'm working with is ordering chocolate chip cookies, so I'm going to enter the product ID of 15650, excuse me. Okay, so now it generates the item name, the price, and I still have 0 in the other, and I have zeros in the other cells that are using formulas. That's because I haven't entered a quantity yet. So suppose they order, let's just say 100, or let's just do, we'll do 100, and there it is. So basically by entering the product ID and the quantity ordered, it does the rest for me. All right, my other 2 product IDs, let's see, for oatmeal was 14980. Notice it's the correct price of $2.99. And then my last one is sugar cookies, 5200, $2.79. That is correct. Now let's say for oatmeal cookies, the manager orders 75, and for sugar cookies, 60. Now it generates all the math for me. And again, for the sake of consistency, let's convert these to currency values. So I'll go to G2 through G4, format them for currency, and the same thing with I2 through K4. And now our order is complete, and you could see the benefit of using VLOOKUP to very quickly generate data values from other sources. All right, so that concludes this tutorial on formulas and functions. I'd like to thank you for watching. And again, just remember, when we get into these more complicated formulas and functions, there is a big benefit to using your formula bar and your insert function command on the left. The insert function command allows you to, it gives you a guided approach to building formulas. It also makes it easier to reference other sources outside of your active sheet, whether it's a different worksheet or another workbook entirely. Okay, and then the formula bar allows you to modify your formula, which often comes in handy for creating absolute references and also for just tweaking a few cell references. Because as I mentioned, sometimes when we want to apply one formula that's in a column to maybe other adjacent columns, instead of rebuilding the formula over and over again, we just simply copy paste or autofill and then just update the cell references that need updating. And we do that by going into the formula bar and then pressing enter to exit. All right, so once again, thank you for watching, and we hope to see you again in one of our computer classes here at the Mercer County Library System. Thank you very much.